Can everyone see that? Okay,
That's great, yes.
great. Since Patrick Collinson's famous call for history with the politics put back, social historians have made significant progress in expanding British political history to include the lower rungs of the social ladder. Social status, and particularly the role of the middling sort, has become a central concern in the political history of early modern England. And yet, as Laura Gowing has rightly pointed out, the relationship between gender and politics has been relatively neglected, perhaps because it has been assumed that women had a negligible role to play. Historians of riot and rebellion have included women in their inquiries, and the letter writing and petitioning of female nonconformists has been discussed. However, in general, popular politics as a subject of inquiry has excluded women by its very focus on people rather than place, privileging mobile political actors rather than those serving out local tenurial obligations, as women often were. The goal of these studies has been to tell national history from the bottom up, which gives preference to stories of mediation between local and national and those who were able to traverse that divide in their political careers. Again, rarely women. Keith Wrightson has pushed for an expansion of what might be considered political in local societies to include the household and interpersonal relationships. And while these are helpful ways of conceptualizing politics for questions of gender, the visibility of women within these alternative frameworks has sometimes upstaged the evidence for women engaging politically in more conventional ways. Non-aristocratic women are most recognizable in historiography as objects to be regulated, subjected to an increasingly strict regime of 17th century neighborly discipline. If active involvement is discussed, it is usually in the context of paid work, women washing altar cloths, acting as sexton or searcher of the dead. But what about women holding elected office? Picture this, it's September 1592, and you've arrived at the annual vestry meeting, along with other sufficient householders of the parish. Everyone listens as the four women standing at the front begin to speak. First, Christian and Maud present accounts of the money they raised through church ales this year. Then they hand their draft accounts to the church wardens, Joan and Agnes, who go on to read a list of all their receipts and disbursements on behalf of the parish this year. They've received money from the widow Sisley Wheaton, churchwarden the year before, and Joan has paid in arrears from her collections as alewarden last year. Joan and Agnes admit that the church stock was not enough to cover all the parish expenses this year, so they've had to advance some of their own money, which the next wardens promised to repay. While this might sound like a feminist fantasy version of 16th century England, this exact scene unfolded in Woodbury, Devon. For 1 year, at least, the majority of elected officers for the parish were women. The evidence for female service in parish government has generally been dismissed as insignificant for two reasons. First off, the scope of female election has been underestimated. Despite Kit French's assertions that female officers were in fact much more widespread in 16th century parishes than earlier commentators had assumed, the instances of female service she found in the Diocese of Bath and Wells continue to be discussed as isolated examples. For my DPhil research, I surveyed the extant accounts of over 200 rural and semi-urban parishes across the country and found 51 parishes that elected women to administrative roles between 1540 and 1660. Within the county of Devon, 38% of all parishes with extant early modern accounts nominated female officers in this period. The majority of these parishes were only electing female churchwardens, but a smaller number of parishes also elected women to be overseers for the poor, sidesmen, or rate collectors. Even acknowledging the frequency of female nomination, however, there is still the question of how many of these nominees to the wardenship actually ended up serving and fulfilling the duties of the role. The prevailing assumption in the literature continues to be that most women chosen for parish offices were expected to appoint deputies. Early modern jurists supported this judgment in the case of women inheriting, quote, offices of justice, but churchwardens were elected financial administrators, and unlike officers of corporate towns, their authority was not legally understood to be judicial or martial. Their selection process was answerable first to custom, then canon law, and custom in most parishes by the early 17th century had settled on one of two solutions to the problem of nominees who would or could not serve. Parishes either allowed nominees to refuse the office and pay a fine, or they required them to remain in the role but choose a deputy to undertake some or all of the duties on their behalf. Very few parishes seem to have combined the two systems, and while I have found a few parishes where women regularly paid fines for refusing the wardenship, such as Kilcampton, Cornwall, and Little Torrington, Devon, deputyship was far more common than outright non-service among parishes that elected women. This would seem to support the assumption that most women were appointing deputies. However, was the rate of deputyship in these parishes driven by the election of women? The Parish of Woodbury is an appropriate case study for looking at female office holding and deputyship because it has a long run of nearly uninterrupted extant accounts from 1535 to 1702 and elected women to the wardenship with some regularity throughout this period. If we track patterns of deputyship in Woodbury, what we find suggests that, in fact, expectations of service for both male and female parish nominees were in flux over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. The use of deputies was not solely or even largely a female phenomenon. Between 1540 and 1700, the sex ratio of nominees appointing deputies was roughly 50-50, with slightly more men serving by deputy than women. Yet men and women were not nominated in equal numbers. This works out to 59% of female nominees and only 13% of male nominees appointing a deputy. Moreover, these figures disguise a complex series of changes over time. If we look at the distribution of instances of deputyship, here in the first plot, we find that deputyship was not introduced until 1625. In the 60 years prior to the introduction of deputyship in Woodbury, 9% of all nominees to the wardenship were women, and as both these charts show, none of these served by deputy. The frequency of female nomination as a whole was increasing over these 2 centuries, but as we see in the second graph, the proportion of these women who served by deputy also increased toward the end of the 17th century. The first graph, which plots female nomination against total deputyship rates for both men and women, suggests 2 turning points. In the 1640s, which I've indicated with a dotted line, changes to the rate of deputyship come to correlate with changes in the number of women nominated. Considering the high rates of women appointing deputies in this period, which we see in the second chart, this may indicate that the nomination of women was driving up deputyship rates as a whole in this period. Then in the 1660s, the rates of both female nomination and deputyship shoot up. What do we see happening in the 1640s and 60s to explain these changes? Changes to the language used to describe deputyship in the warden's accounts offer a clue. In all instances of deputyship before 1630, the account headings list the original nominees as the acting church wardens, with deputies only mentioned as having exhibited the accounts. This would seem to indicate that the role of the deputies was to speak for the elected wardens at meetings and perhaps perform other tasks as needed, but that they were not the ones making the accounts or receiving and dispersing the sums therein. From 1630 to 1660, this formulation was gradually replaced by other phrasings, which suggest that more authority was being ceded to deputies. So in 1640, we see the deputy's name listed before the name of the officer he was representing, with the indication that the deputy was the one making the account. In 1648, there is an example of the appellation of deputy being dropped entirely, with the heading simply saying that the deputies were church wardens for the original nominees. By the 1660s, there's a decisive change. Deputies were invariably listed as the acting church wardens, with the fact of their deputyship only being stated as an afterthought, sometimes even in a marginal note. Significantly, this diminution in the role of the original nominee parallels the rising banality of deputyship. In the 1660s, only 50% of elected wardens were serving their terms in person. And from then on, deputies continued to make up about a quarter of the serving officers up to the end of the century. In the 1690s, the redundancy of the original nominees is made crystal clear by the appearance of deputies serving for landholders who were, in fact, already deceased. Thus, we see a transition after 1640 in the role of church wardens vis-a-vis their deputies. with deputies no longer assisting the wardens, but rather starting to replace them in a process of professionalization. We see this professionalization of the deputyship in the increasing rate of repeat service among deputies. By marking each repeating deputy with a different color in a timeline and leaving the unique deputies white, it is possible to observe how instances of repeat service began to cluster by the end of the 17th century. By the 1680s, these career deputies were the only people serving as deputies in the parish. But if the appointment of deputies was so commonplace by the end of the 17th century, why even go through the election process? Specifically, why were women being nominated in higher numbers if there was little expectation that they would serve? The reason, I would argue, was the same reason they were eligible in the first place. Their land tenure furnished security for the church stock during their terms. Parishes where the wardenship rotated among landed households tended to favor deputyship over a system of fines because outright refusals would break up the rotation order. And while the parish of Woodbury did not have a well-articulated rotation order, the election of wardens was clearly being dictated by their land holdings, because account entries cite the tenement being represented along with each officer's name. Service for named tenements, as I have termed this pattern, could come in the form of officers serving for their own dwelling or on behalf of another person's house or lands. Some of these entries mention service for tenements in the context of deputyship, but in most cases, the relationship between the tenant and the person representing the tenement in office is not specified. However, considering the trend of deputies increasingly being referred to as church wardens for other people, omitting the deputy nomenclature, it is likely that these examples of people serving for other people's land were yet another phase in the evolution of the deputyship. This interpretation is supported by the data. We find instances of service for named tenements first arising at the exact same time as more typical deputyship appears in the parish records. When we add a line to our previous graph to represent change in the frequency with which the accounts name wardens as representatives of specific tenements, an inverse relationship between female nomination and service for tenements emerges. In the 1660s, female nomination and deputyship were at their peaks, and yet in the decades following, they decreased slightly, while service for named tenements increased dramatically. This fits a scenario in which women were being named as nominees less frequently because their election was no longer necessary for their land to be used as a security. In essence, deputies were able to serve for the tenements directly, circumventing female nominees. We saw this separation of office holding and property occurring already in the instances of men serving as deputies for deceased landholders. And we see it also in the pattern of leadership in the final years of the 17th century. Thomas Turner, John Stabeck Jr., and John Cornish, 3 repeat deputies, took turns serving the wardenship in their capacity as deputies in all but 1 year from 1693 to 1700. That year, 1698, Thomas Turner is listed as the church warden with no mention of deputyship, though he had just served 3 years as a deputy and would serve for another consecutive year as a deputy after that. His status as deputy and the nominees he served for no longer seemed necessary to mention. The deputies had become the default church wardens, making female and male nominees merely placeholders. When we think of local history, we might be inclined to associate it with antiquarians, hobbyists, and amateur historians. This seems only appropriate, considering the history of local politics is in fact a history of amateurs. Women never ascended to the ranks of the professional politician in early modern England. As we've seen in Woodbury, women tended to retreat into the background when the professionals came onto the scene. The political authority of women was circumstantial, a matter of convenience rather than demand. Local politics have always been the place to look for female voters and office holders when no other level of government was open to them, whether in the early modern rural parish or the 19th century London ward. Finally, as I hope I've demonstrated today, the study of local politics as a site for female activity has great potential for answering broader historical questions about how popular understandings of community and participatory politics changed as bureaucracies coalesced and politics were professionalized. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. That was absolutely fascinating. And 15 minutes, absolutely. Well done. So our next speaker today is Honor Morris, who is a research student at King's College London, exploring the lives of working class women in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. And Honor will be talking today about high-rise motherhood, the impact of 1970s council housing on working class mothering. So Honor, if you would just like to go ahead and share your screen now.
Yeah. There we go. Can everyone see that?
Good. That's great.
Okay, so the second half of the 20th century saw significant changes to the urban landscape of Britain. New modern council estates were marked by multi-storey towers, which began to populate city skylines from the mid-1950s. Patrick Dunlevy, in his 1981 work on the politics of mass housing, estimated that the public housing drive between 1955 and 1975 led to the erection of nearly 440,000 high-rise flats. This was alongside mass council-mandated slum clearances, which saw over 3 million people rehoused, and altered the patterns of many working-class lives. Significantly, it removed tenants from comfortably familiar life on a street into a new and often daunting life, stories above the ground. Despite creating markedly improved living conditions and positive experiences for many households, the social malaise which came to be associated with high-rise housing was evident in popular opinion, as well as an academic concern in the years of the high-rise housing boom and in the decades immediately after. This is evident in the social studies and documentaries from the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s, which formed the primary source base for this paper, including the work of Pearl Jeffcott, Tony Parker and Elizabeth Gittis, which focused on high-rise housing, plus documentaries considering the experience of people living on council estates. Where the Houses Used to Be was a documentary released in 1971, and it focused on an estate in Battersea. Parents in Playgroups was released in 1975 by the Preschool Playgroups Association and featured testimony from an estate in Bootle, Liverpool. The studies and documentaries showed that one group of tenants reporting especially negative experiences were mothers with young children. This issue has recently been considered in an article by Lynn Abrams, Linda Fleming, Ade Kearns, Barry Hasley and Valerie Wright, which focused mainly on Jeffcott's findings in Glasgow. Their work drew attention to the isolating physical characteristics of the housing environment of tower block flats, as well as the context of women's economic dependence essential to understanding mothers' negative experiences of high-rise housing. This paper will build on their work by drawing further focus through analysis of additional studies to the ways that working class mothering was impacted by high-rise living. In doing so, it will also highlight the importance of playgroups as a holistic approach to modern parenting that proved important in addressing the issues of working class mothering on council estates. Moving into high-rise flats on modern estates, working class mothers were forced to adapt to living in new and unfamiliar spaces. The extent that this new environment caused acute feelings of isolation has been a notable consideration of contemporary investigations. Jeffcott, Gittis and Parker, in their respective studies on high-rise housing, found that the physical environment of high-rise flats created issues for socialisation, which was particularly keenly felt by mothers who were spending significant amounts of time at home. Additionally, the isolating characteristics of flat life and the absence of easily accessible social networks has been highlighted in Michael Romin's recent work on the Aylesbury estate in South East London. Testimony from working class women in social studies throughout England reinforces the findings of Abrams, Fleming, Kearns, Hasley and Wright in Glasgow, showing that community building through traditional points of interaction with neighbours, such as over the garden wall or outside the front door, for example, were no longer available to working class mothers who struggled to recreate the sense of community they felt had been lost, relying on serendipitous meetings in communal spaces to create interactions which were few and far between. This approach to socialising links into John Lawrence's work on community in post-war England. Lawrence considered that, conscious of retaining their privacy, working class people rarely opened their homes to those who were not very close friends or family, which left communal spaces as the primary location for interaction. An unnamed mother featured in the documentary Where the Houses Used to Be, living on the Rollo and Doddington estate in Battersea, had difficulty forming connections with other residents on her floor, referencing the inability to go out on the doorstep and have a chat. A decade later, Audrey Gold, a 35-year-old mother of two living in a tower block flat featured in Tony Parker's 1983 study, The People of Providence, complained at the loss of a front door onto a street where there'll always be someone to talk to. The benefits of increased privacy in high-rise flats, which in itself was highly valued for working class residents, were outweighed for many mothers by the dearth of casual social interactions in tower blocks where they spent the majority of their time. The physical character of the flats also reinforced their isolation. The anonymity and conformity that rental restrictions enforced meant that self-expression, especially within the communal space of the flat, was limited, which gave the appearance of sterility and soullessness. This was reinforced by the flat's physical separation from ground level, which meant that tenants were often reported seeing no one on a regular basis, detailing that the view from their windows was so high they were unable to see or hear passers-by, or more commonly that a reliance on the building's lifts to enter and exit created a barrier to their ease of movement. Elizabeth Gitters considered the issues of lifts as especially problematic for mothers trying to manoeuvre children, prams and shopping bags into a lift with the added anxiety that it might be busy or out of order. Jeffcott's study found similar issues relating to the lifts, recounting an incident when a mother had to carry her child, pram and shopping up 18 flights of stairs as the lift was out of order. Issues caused by living in tower blocks were certainly not specific to mothers, but Jeffcott and Gittys both found in their studies that they affected mothers disproportionately. However, that's not to say that this bleak picture was reproduced for every mother living in a tower block. There were mothers who reported positive experiences, especially where their previous accommodation had been particularly awful, or in cases where they had been able to form a community more successfully. What the study showed more than anything was how easily the characteristics of tower block life could become a problem for working class mothers. And this was reinforced by working class cultural approaches to motherhood, which still imbued many communities and working class women's lives. This meant that, recent scholarship on motherhood, such as the work of Helen McCarthy, Laura Paterson and Eve Worth, has drawn focus to the ways in which mothers negotiated their lives as workers, as working motherhood became increasingly socially accepted as the norm in the post-war period. McCarthy, in her recent book, Double Lives, has shown that women from all social backgrounds were beginning to engage in work for reasons beyond economic necessity, to promote autonomy, stimulation and friendship, which they were unable to achieve within their domestic role. However, for women living in working class communities in the long 1970s, evidence from social studies has shown that more traditional ideas of motherhood and childcare responsibilities still greatly imbued their understandings of womanhood, which meant that newer concepts of women's freedom, which took them away from their familial responsibility in the home, were not altogether embraced. A sustained connection between womanhood and motherhood was fostered by a cultural expectation of motherhood as a pinnacle of female achievement for working class women. This was reinforced by an inadequacy in working class women's education. This was reinforced by the inadequacy in working class women's education to promote engaging career options and stimulate a sense of attainment outside of the bounds of marriage and motherhood. And whilst some working class mothers may have wanted to work, this was affected by their scepticism about external childcare, which resonated with long-standing ideas of the good mother linked to Bowlbyism and attachment theory, which still lingered in working class consciousness. Economic necessity remained the primary driver for working class women seeking employment in this period, as a strong link endured between working class motherhood and domesticity, a connection which was strained by the trying circumstances of high-rise living. In addition to the issues of isolation, mothers living in high-rise flats also face the difficulty of raising children in a relatively confined environment with little easy access to outside space. Often adequate play areas for children on estates were left wanting, but where they were available, concerns over their cleanliness and hygiene, the safety of apparatus, the fear of unwelcome influences from older children or strangers, and the distance that their children had to travel to reach the play areas, and the issue of getting to them quickly should the need arise, prevented mothers from allowing their children to play unsupervised. Moreover, balconies, which were the only outside space connected to the flats, were felt to be too unsafe to be suitable areas of play, and communal corridors were also out on account of the disturbance to neighbours. Mothers living in flats were therefore forced to factor taking their child outside to play into their daily routine, reporting the adverse effect on their children's behaviour, and as a result, their own well-being if they kept them inside all day. Yvonne Mulholland, a mother interviewed for the Parents in Playgroups documentary, explained the effects of having to keep her child inside owing to poor facilities. Her son Gerald's unrelenting need for attention would become so much that she recalled, her temper would be that wound up in myself that I knew if I hit Gerald, if he'd done something naughty and I'd hit him, I'd go too far. So I used to go in the bedroom, I used to sit on the bed and I used to get my fists clenched and I'd punch the bed and I'd scream at the top of my voice and then I'd be all right. Shimon also noted in her study, Sheila Shimlin in her work investigating preschool provision, noted in her study that attempting to dissuade young children from entering into activities which might cause undue disturbance to other residents caused great anxiety, as noise was a source of difficulty with neighbours and children were naturally energetic. Restricting the types of activities children could undertake inside the flat for the sake of communal civility was also referenced in the testimony of the mother from the Donington and Rollo estate. She recounted that her children had to play quiet games owing to the almost constant complaints and were not allowed to jump in order to maintain the peace. Adapting parenting methods to their new environment, working class mothers showed evident need for some form of facility to allow their children to play safely, which was facilitated by the growth of the Preschool Playgroups Association. Started in the early 1960s by middle class mother Belle Tutev to deal with the dearth of state-funded preschool provision, playgroups were community-based parent-run groups which offered a safe and stimulating environment for children for short sessions of a few hours a day. For working class communities, they became a way to rectify the issue of where children could safely play, which was especially necessary in modern council housing, but also became an indispensable asset to the well-being of mothers. Jean Summer, a playgroup worker on the Bootle estate, commented in her interview for Parents in Playgroups that the groups were an absolute must on this estate or any estate where children are confined to the likes of flats. It involves the whole family. The groups gave children adequate space to engage in loud and messy play, easing their behaviour at home, but they also provided mothers with a sense of community, encouraging their involvement in the group's running. Playgroups became mother care as much as childcare. The testimony of Joan Fazackerley, a PPA worker who helped to set up the Bootle Playgroup, spoke to the sheer necessity of playgroups for working class women and their impetus to have somewhere that would relieve them of some of the anxieties of mothering on an estate. She noted that she was astounded when she arrived to speak to the mothers on the estate. She recalled, "I'd never seen anything like it. It was absolutely packed from the front to the back, and every woman who was there must appear, it seemed to me, have a child or a toddler or have a baby or a toddler or an older child on her knee." She continued, "I think if we start with the parents and look after them, this must ultimately benefit the children. It's been said that there's no greater investment in children than investing in parents. I think this is what playgroups are about. We start by looking at the needs of the parents and child together in the short term. We've got to concentrate on the parent." Another facility set up in Walthamstow in the late 1960s, the history of which is told through the oral history archive Doing It Ourselves, also referenced this dual purpose for playgroups. Judith Marchant, who instigated setting up the cooperative nursery, considered that mothers didn't just want to drop off their child, they needed to stay and talk and be welcomed. Playgroups counteracted working class negative attitudes towards childcare for significant amounts of mothers on estates, not only as the need for care outside of the home was much greater for working class mothering in flats, but also the volunteer-led ethos of the groups aligned with working class women's culturally influenced ideas of motherhood, allowing them to remain with their children for the duration of the session. Playgroups were not entirely successful in every instance, however. Janet Finch has shown that there were considerable difficulties in adapting middle class values into working class communities, and the short sessions did not suit mothers who needed childcare in order to engage in full-time work. However, playgroups undoubtedly offered a lifeline to mothers on estates and altered mothering practices for many women who would otherwise have not become involved in group play with their children outside of the home. Playgroups promoted children's cognitive development as expert opinion began to advise greater parental interaction with children, learning through play, speaking to, reading with and playing with children, as well as toys that promoted learning through play, which gave working class women increased access to new parenting techniques. But it also helped mothers to increase their confidence in social situations and foster a self-belief in their ability to undertake tasks. For some, it even led to vocational training opportunities through the PPA, giving working class women opportunities for achievement that had not been available to them prior to having children. Considerations of motherhood on new council estates from both contemporary studies and historiography have been generally negative, and with good reason. The environment of council estates cannot be under-acknowledged as producing a specific context for motherhood. And whilst the symptoms of isolation and unhappiness may have also been paralleled across the classes, evident in the rhetoric of the more middle-class feminist movement, the causes were constructed within class culture and opportunity. Linking into greater narratives of working class women's education and prospects for achievement, the history of working class motherhood shows evidence of a structural class divide which impacted the way that working class women raised their children and understood not only their role as mothers, but also their role as women. Thank you.
Thank you, Honor. That was really, really interesting. Brilliant. And thank you all for coming along today and taking part. With that, that's That's it. That's a close. Okay, thank you very much.